The Henry N. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington presents World Focus, a continuing series on international political, social, economic, and cultural issues.
The lectures you are about to see are the ninth in the Stroum Lectureship in Jewish Studies, a series which has brought outstanding scholars to the University of Washington over the past decade. Two of the series have been published and won international recognition as original contributions to scholarship. They are Yehuda Bauer's The Holocaust in Historical Perspective and Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's Zachor, winner of the National Jewish Book Award for work in history. This year's lecturer, Aharon Appelfeld, was born in Czernowitz, Bukovina. In the Nazi sweep east, his mother was killed and he was transported to the labor camp at Transnistria, from which he soon escaped. He was 8 years old. For the next 3 years, he wandered the forests, keeping what he calls the sweet secret of his Jewishness. Sometime in 1944, he was picked up by the Red Army, served in field kitchens in the Ukraine, and after the war, made his way to Italy. In 1946, he emigrated to Palestine. Though he only learned Hebrew at that point in his life, he now writes exclusively in Hebrew and is known as one of its distinctive stylists. A professor of Hebrew literature at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, his published works include 6 collections of stories, a book of essays, and 7 novels, of which 4, Badenheim 1939, The Age of Wonders, Tzili, The Story of a Life, and The Retreat have been translated into English. He has been described by Irving Howe as one of the best novelists alive, and his works have been hailed as magical, beautifully composed and profoundly moving, elegant, resonant, and deeply disturbing. In 1983, Professor Appelfeld was honored with the Israel Prize for Literature, and in 1984, he was honored with a nomination for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Professor Appelfeld spoke movingly, indeed hauntingly, of his own experiences and how, as a novelist, he came to portray his remembrances of things past. His visit to the University of Washington as Stroum Lecturer in Jewish Studies was a memorable event. Those present sat in silence as Professor Appelfeld spoke of writing about the Holocaust, a novelist's reflections. As several members of the audience said to me after the lectures, we had the feeling of being in the presence of greatness. I can only agree.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, tonight I'm going to speak about writing fiction on the Holocaust. In other words, how to combine horrors with beauty, the unimaginable with imagination. Writing about an individual in a world where the I was erased. Is it not a desecration to use literary means, rhythmical sentences, images, nice words to talk about such a pain? Perhaps the naked documents should speak for themselves. What we call facts, numbers, dates, and places. And perhaps not to speak at all, to maintain a deep silence. Life, of course, is not a series of questions that gives answers. Living people do not react in abstract terms. Life has its own rhythm in its own circle. Tonight I'm not going to deny ideas, theories, and ideologies. We know very well their power. But beyond them, there is our living body, our living soul. In the ghettos, camps, and shelters, poems and songs were written. And in the evenings, melodies overwhelmed the streets. It was a strange mixture of liturgy and folk songs, which became at moments hymns of pain and protest. We could not fight empires, but melody became one of our weapons to fight despair. In the ghettos and in the camps, we learned how to struggle with death. It assumed different forms, most of them painful and ugly. But Jewish melodies, however, never left us. It was more than magic. I'm mentioning this to point out that even in the darkest moments, there was a deep need for a word, a melody. Words and melody are not only good for diversion and entertainment, they are also vehicles for yearnings, protest, prayer, and despair. Silence, no doubt, is the most perfect language, but people cannot live in it continuously. Even prayer needs words. Tonight, I wish to describe and to a certain extent characterize the first formless expressions which burst out of us immediately after the war. The war showed us that even in the most horrible moments, life is nonetheless life. In the ghettos and camps, people loved, hoped, took French evening courses and 4 o'clock tea. Even on the edge of death, someone will whisper, "I love you, I remember you." Is it even necessary to say the children played? The closer we are to death, the greater the resistance to it. The sense of fear some become dulled. Everyone holds to his own dim hope, usually some matter of little consequence. Washing oneself, for instance. I remember a young man who refused to abandon his math notebooks. He continuously reviewed his lessons in order to qualify for the next grade. This curious activity between one forced expulsion and the other helped him maintain his composure. For years we lived in the shadow of death, but if one may speak this way, we hardly gave it much thought. The selfish grasping for every crumb and every piece of ragged cloth that at times became very ugly, was a clear demonstration of our denial of death. But after the war, when the death threat became less ominous, hope dimmed, then, ironically, gloom prevailed. Hope was revealed in all its nakedness. Only you yourself remained. Your own nakedness was an accusation against you. I remember those whose sadness so overwhelmed them that it lured them into a kind of hibernation from which they never awoke. The longing for sleep became a real threat. We drank coffee and alcohol to stay awake. During the war, we had imagined that for years to come, until old age, we would never cease recounting all those horrors. Some survived because of this compulsion to tell. After the war, they would tell everything. That, of course, was one of the self-delusive tricks people exploited to stay alive. After the war, the very opposite happened. People chose to shut it all up inside. Everything that had happened seemed so enormous, so improbable that it seemed to the witness himself that he was making it up. The bitter facts left no doubt in anyone's minds that an accusation was inscribed on every survivor's forehead. That, of course, was only a feeling, but every true feeling become in time a source of torment. Furthermore, the telling requires some common ground with others. Without common ground, misunderstanding arise. The ghettos and the camps were so far removed from human experience that even those who went through them were not always aware of what was happening to them and what was happening within them. This thicket blocked tongues and made people dumb. Even so many facts have been gathered about the Holocaust, it seems that its core has not yet been touched. The most carefully checked facts are only hide the core, what we fear so much. For a long time after the Holocaust, people did not talk about their experience. Whoever asked and interested himself in them or tried to understand them was considered a past. That was an escape, of course. Silence can also be a form of speech, often a more intense form. The urge to talk and the urge to remain silent are like two powerful forces which traverse the lengths and the breadths of my generation's ability to express itself. This is, of course, is not a matter of artistic technique, but the very heart of the oppressive feeling. Speech, even in its most imperfect, has meaning beyond all artistic treatment and reference. Without speech, all is chaos and sad resignation. This we knew. Nonetheless, the desire to withhold our speech was more powerful. Furthermore, every artistic expression after the Holocaust seemed to us both contemptible and ridiculous. Every word which left our mouths to indicate something or to characterize something was wrapped in shame. Every attempt to speak brought in even a deeper silence. But not everyone was silent. The desire to tell, which had been bound up for years, burst and took on various and strange forms. Since new words had not been created, people used the old words, those which had served them before. This, of course, was a mockery, and it hurt. I want just to examine some of these expressions. Right after the war, entertainment troupes were formed. There were a combination of the old and the young, including former entertainers, singers, young people who had grown up in the bunkers, and all sorts of skinny people who sought release in such diversions. These sprang up spontaneously and moved from one transition camp to another. They sang, held recitations, and told jokes. Had it not been for certain grotesque hints, they could have been gypsies who wandered from village to village entertaining their farmers. What did these groups try to express? It is, of course, difficult to generalize, but what they were essentially doing was showing the hidden desire of the instinct to bring us back to life. On another level, it was a kind of protest against suffering and sadness. And above all, however, it was suppressive. No one knew what to do with his life which had been survived. The sadness and the mourning had passed the point of pain and could no longer be called sadness or mourning. Beyond a certain point, you are hurled into another sphere, in this case into the grotesque, again to eat, again to drink, again to have to worry about place, to get money. No one had the strength to release the mourning which was in him, and so people sought diversion, anything but not to be alone with oneself. The entertainment troops were perhaps the most authentic expression of this secret desire. I remember people who protested against these cheap performances and considered them a desecration. We had not yet understood that the tragic, too, had been taken away from us. The feeling in which we were immersed after the war were already beyond the tragic. The tragic means awareness, the ability to stand face to face with what you know. The tragic is personified in the individual, in his suffering. But the dimensions of our suffering could not find expression in the soul of the individual. The moment the individual tried to confront his consciousness, he collapsed beneath its weight. In the liberated camps, some actors tried to revive the essentially tragic, classical Jewish repertoire. In the end, the tragic seemed even more ridiculous than the cheap entertainment. Today, I have a better understanding of the primitive, spontaneous, cheap entertainment that filled up the empty space which threatened to overwhelm us. Now I know that those were the first buds of a different conception of artistic expression. The comic grotesque, which of course was only then beginning. Alongside the light amusement, other expression arose. The religious, for example. After every great catastrophe, the human soul seeks comfort in superstition and metaphysics. So they are very different, of course. On the warm beach of Italy, after the war, there wandered rebukers, preachers, consolers, and others whose metaphysics kindled in them words. In the confused, drunken noise, everything seemed insane. That was the start of some kind of inner dialogue, which eventually developed into the metaphysics of the Holocaust. Light entertainment and religious feelings blended together after the war to become a new kind of grotesque. The moral expression seemed to disappear. Morals are specific and developed within a social background. The war also destroys standards of good and evil. Free choice and determination were removed from our hands. Not who you were or what you did, but your being a Jew determined everything. For years we had been given into the blind hands of fate. No wonder the world came to be seen as a violent caprice. Try to tell someone, do this, do that. That is good, that is bad. Who knows what is good and what is bad? There were plenty of opportunities for evil, but also for generosity and self-sacrifice as well. Between the search and the stammer, there were also the distortions, the hack writers who sold our suffering, the politicians with their high and mighty phrases, the pseudo-romantic theologians with their complaints against the heavenly authority. I'm not trying to judge this or that expression, but this I will say. They enclosed and buried the bitter ordeal in cheap commentaries and simplistic phrases. The artistic expression after the Holocaust seemed tasteless. The pain and the suffering demanded silence. If not that, then wild screaming. Every attempt to beautify, every attempt to sweeten it was like a burning pain. Furthermore, art, not without reason, was associated in our minds with the sphere of European culture whose victims we were. One evening, I recall, a veteran actor, formerly from the Wilner Truppe, performed in the transit camp. He recited Razin's poems. For a moment, it seemed as if he were trying to bring us back to the long-gone days, to the remnants of ourselves. It was precisely this aesthetic refinement which caused the audience to reject him. There was quite a stir, and the embarrassed man left the stage crying. The desire to forget was overwhelming. Then those wonderful means of forgetting evolved. Sleep, sleep, and sleep. The mad rush for money, bathing in the sea, and the most important, entertainment. Don't you dare to mention the war. If not for the few who could not contain their suffering, the victims themselves would have pushed the horrors to oblivion. I'm deliberately recalling the first days after the war. It was then that the first stammering, primitive expressions appeared. Whatever followed was extraction, elaboration, or delusion. The urge to shut it in and the urge to speak were separated as if by a gulf, and only the late artistic expression, which came years later, attempt to bridge the gap between them. It took a while for the artistic expression to grow. It needed some kind of human form to hint at the possibility. It was not enough to protest. The new form, if one may speak as such, came in the shape of the children. These were children whose facial expressions were shaped by the war years in the forests and monasteries. There were some among them who sang well, I say well, even though most of them had raspy voices. They sang a mixture of Jewish melodies and snatches of tunes from the monastery organ. In these children, the strains came together and emerged as a new melody. It was something sad, stammering and grotesque. They were obscure tones of the kind that children alone in their blind innocence can create. I cannot recall the lyrics, but I remember the faces. They stood on a box and sang. After performing, they would remove their hats and pass them around. Violent impresarios took these children under their protection and dragged them from camp to camp. There were girls too. I remember one of them well. Amalia was her name. A child of about 10 who performed every evening. Her repertoire consisted of Jewish folk songs and the sounds of the forest. Her body was thin, bird-like, and it seemed as if she were about to fly. There were also child acrobats who walked the tightrope. In the forest, they had learned to balance on thin branches all the way to the treetops. Among them were twins who juggled wooden balls. And there were children who imitated the sounds of birds and animals. Scores of children like this wandered about the camps, while the adults tried to forget, to suppress what had happened, to make their way among the living. The children brought suffering to a refined state in the way that perhaps only a folk song can. The children did not have a tangible memory of what had happened. Instead, there was a dark, nameless fear which had settled into every cell of their bodies. Since the fear was intangible, they could not suppress it. It became part of their being, like arms and legs. When they sang, imitated sounds, or juggled, suffering was personified in their every movement, even in their laughter. Adults would chase them away at times because their laughter too was sad. So I was only a boy. I remember those long discussions lasting into the night. Even then we knew that shouting out was not enough. We had to find the forum for the outcry. Otherwise, it would seem like madness or worse, false. Unwittingly, those wandering children supplied the form for the poetics of the suffering. Their voices contained only what the inside was in them: suffering, blindness, innocence. Girls like Amalia were the authentic creatures of the Holocaust literature. The Holocaust penetrated in their bodies, in their souls, blindly, and became part of them. The so-called Holocaust literature is mainly a pathetic literature, a tendential literature. The pathetic expression naturally tends towards the emotional, the high tone, the generalization, and beyond them to the abstraction. The pathetic expression has no patience for details. But the pathetic, even poor pathos, if such exists, because it refuses to deal with detail, must sooner or later turn into metaphysics. When I say refuse to deal with detail, this is not, of course, caprice or weakness, but an objective difficulty. The Holocaust dulled the sense of the eye. The eye is the source for understanding life, has sunken in the general suffering. Individuality became blurred. Those the tendency to speak of the Holocaust in general terms. Even the best documentary, rather than explaining the suffering of the individual, attempt to arrive at some metaphysical generalization. The wounded eye was covered and suppressed, and above it there has been created a vast field of history, theological. Since the war, a wide metaphysical theory has been developed. I'm not denying the need to create theories as a refuge for distress, but I'm suspicious of theories because they replace experience with abstractions. Children like Amalia absorb the horror totally. They were not able to suppress, or what it is called, rationalize their emotions. The nightmare remained blocked in them. They perhaps were not able to remember places, streets, dates, camps, but the nightmare became for them the source from which they draw the deepest emotion. Art, by its very nature, needs the raw field of unconsciousness, blindness, and innocence. In children like Amalia, there was this field. They created the melody, their own melody, in which past and present were bound together. Of course, art cannot restore life, cannot create belief, cannot bring religion alive. But perhaps it can, by its modest means, to revive the secrets of the eye, which were damaged by demonic external powers and suppressed by the victims themselves. And perhaps turn those secrets into melodies, which were always the magic power of life. Thank you very much.